We're going to continue with our program, and I'm going to be introducing our next presenter, Mr. Perry Dane. Perry Dane is a professor of law at Rutgers Law School. His research and teaching interests, in addition to vexillology, include constitutionalism, conflict of laws, legal pluralism, the law of marriage, the jurisprudence of Jewish law, jurisdiction, the law of charities, education law, interfaith dialogue, anti-Semitism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is also a distinguished fellow of the Faculty of Humanities of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The paper he delivered at last year's annual meeting, What Banner Shall We Raise? On Scholarship and Design in Vexillology, has been published in the 2025 edition of Raven, NAVA's premier scholarly journal. Sir, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I will stand here. So, in a pair of earlier papers published many years apart in Raven, I critiqued some of the prevailing ideas about flag design and flag scholarship. And I suggested that the study of flags requires what I called a rich and sophisticated practice of flag design. And the design of flags can only be improved by a rich and sophisticated scholarly foundation. That's why I'm a law professor. Those two articles included examples of what I had in mind, but I didn't try to follow through in a more affirmative way to do the work, the actual work of articulating what a new approach to flag aesthetics might entail. That's sort of the one of the professional problems with legal scholarship, is that you do a lot of critiquing, right? But the real challenge is to actually move forward with something more affirmative. So this paper will try to begin that more detailed project. The premise I want to introduce and articulate begins with my earlier emphasis on flag genres. As I explained in one of my earlier pieces, the one published in 2008, with some notable and important exceptions, flag design has tended over the centuries to be guided by various distinct styles or genres, sometimes called flag families, many of them borrowed from related disciplines. These genres include flags based on heraldic elements, flags based on a single, simple religious symbol that's been used over the centuries, the cross, flags based on the colors of liveries, flags based on governmental seals. You can all boo now. And we could add more genres, flags incorporating the styles of calligraphy and various traditions of calligraphy, and complex flags. And complex flags have been used over the centuries, both to represent the merits or the alleged merits of absolute monarchy, but also revolutionary defiance. So far, so good. This paper, though, broadens that observation to a more general thesis. It seems to me, any productive aesthetic description and criticism of flag design needs to try to understand them in relationship to each other. Relationships among flags are important in their own right. Individual flags are part of a larger ecosystem of flags, and to really understand not just the history of flags, but the aesthetics of flags, we need to understand them as part of that ecology. And thinking of that ecology can also help us consider what makes for good flag design. And to consider in a broader context some of the alleged considerations for good flag design that have become prominent in recent years. So flags relate to each other in many ways. This paper will focus on four admittedly overlapping forms that these relationships can take. So these are genre, which is something I've already begun discussing. Second is hierarchical or functional relationships among flags. Third are just spatial groupings of flags, flags that tend to be displayed together or that can be displayed together. And finally, are generational or genealogical relationships among flags. So let's begin with genre. Now, you'll find, not surprisingly, that my discussion here connects with Steve Knowlton's really wonderful, rich, and nuanced paper that was presented yesterday. I'm delighted by those connections for a few reasons, but mostly because one of the marks of any serious scholarly effort is that authors and their works are in conversation with each other. So it's a good sign that Steve and I can be in conversation with each other. And if I had more time to revise my paper, I'd try to speak more directly to some of Steve's important insights. But for now, I'll have you do all that work and make those connections and yourself. So I'll bring up his paper here and there where I've been able to revise mine, but won't really try to sort of make the effort at a full-fledged encounter between the two. In any event, as both Steve and I have emphasized, flags within the same genre often build on each other. Thus, for example, just as the French Revolution led to the beginning of the classic French flag, that flag in turn influenced other flags that had similar revolutionary aspirations. Italy, Ireland. That basic tricolor pattern can admit of some variations, right? So for example, you can replace the white central band with yellow, mediating between those two bolder colors on either side of it, and you get the flags of Belgium and more recently Chad. But this process of direct, uncomplicated imitation can only go so far. You can only have sort of so many flags that are just sort of directly inspired as imitations in one way or another of the French tricolor. And at some point, there has to be some development within that genre. And one way to develop the genre is to add complexity, the sort of complexity that's often derided by some flag design commentators, but which it seems to me is a natural part of development within a genre. So you can add a sort of historic central element, as in the flag of Mexico. A different genre that deserves more thoughtful consideration than it has sometimes received is the notorious, you can boo again, seal on a bedsheet. Thank you. That dismissive label tempts us to overlook some notable and even potentially aesthetically significant questions. For example, do many American state flags bore us? And they bore me as much as anybody, but do many American state flags bore us merely because they have seals on a bedsheet, so to speak, or because all the bedsheets are blue, right? Is that the problem? And is that the problem that in some ways is more significant than the fact that there's so-called seals on a bedsheet? Would flags with more distinctive and interesting colors somehow mitigate what would seem to be the sameness of the seal on a bedsheet pattern? There's also a difference, right? So if we're willing to take this genre seriously, right, and not just dismiss it out of hand, it turns out that there's also a difference between seals and coats of arms on a flag, right? That's not insignificant. And that in turn suggests a couple of questions. Admitting the problems with the genre as a whole, which of these subgenres, so you have seals on the one hand, coats of arms on the other, which of these subgenres are at least potentially more successful? And better yet, a sort of an even more interesting question, does the existence of these two distinct subgenres mitigate the sense that all seals on a bedsheet are the same? They're not all the same, right? They're different in sort of interesting ways that we can identify. But focusing on the role and importance of genres in flag design has an even more important consequence. Genres limit and constrain, right? That's what a genre is, right? In many ways, it limits and constrains. It establishes some fundamental patterns that shape and provoke and ultimately nourish the creative process. There's a sort of paradox built into the very idea of a genre that on the one hand, it is limiting, it is constraining, it is controlling, it is narrow. On the other hand, it is all of that for the sake of inspiring creativity, right? And we see that in other fields. So consider the symphonies of the classical era, right? Most famously, the works of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. In one sense, right? In one sense, all classical symphonies are the same, right? In one sort of very limited sense, in the sense that they fall into a genre, right? There's the exposition and the development, right? And the recapitulation. There's a pattern that all of these classical symphonies fall into, right? Whether it's Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven. And yet they're all radically and beautifully different, right? And you can see Mozart or Beethoven, or for that matter, even Haydn early on, taking on the constraints of that genre and just doing really remarkable things within those constraints, and to some extent by virtue of those constraints, right? It's the constraints that help inspire the creativity. Genres are not static things. They evolve and they morph, they recede, they revive, and I'll have more to say about that in the last part of the paper. Now, it's of course legitimate to criticize an entire genre, but such criticism always risks turning dogmatic and counterproductive. Modern architects famously condemned prior generations, and sometimes they condemned those prior generations so vehemently that they proposed, for example, building a modern international style office tower on top of Grand Central's terminal. Right, so there at the bottom, you can see Grand Central Terminal, right? And the building barely survived, right? Barely survived getting topped off by this very tall, very modern office tower because of the new landmark preservation laws that, in my capacity as a law professor, I can tell you were upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. More interesting, liberating, and lasting is criticism. So it seems to me that more interesting than criticism of a genre, right, which, as I say, can be overly dogmatic, more interesting is criticism within a genre. To put it in terms familiar to the vexillological conversation, we might want to think less about condemning all seals on a bed sheet than about finding ways to distinguish more successful from less successful seals on a bed sheet. In other words, could flag designers successfully, that, by the way, is Penn Station, which was torn down to our everlasting regret. Are there seals on a bed sheet that might in fact, or so-called seals on a bed sheet that might in fact be spectacularly successful? The flag of the president of Ukraine, for example. And I don't think that anyone would argue that that's just a sort of mere seal on a bed sheet. And yet, as a matter of genre, that's exactly what it is. The second type of relationship that's worth exploring among flags is hierarchical or functional. National flags often, though not always, have a different look and feel than subnational or city flags. These, in turn, look different than corporate flags or university flags or the like. But the precise way that these different types of flags relate to each other can carry enormous significance. So consider again the seal on the bed sheet. I keep coming back to it. I apologize for that. You can boo again. So consider again the seal on the bed sheet. Vexillological historians have convincingly argued that after the Civil War, state flags began to be designed or to take on a more prominent role. Many states that had fought on the Union side resisted the trend to have state flags, and when for one reason or another they sort of felt forced to announce a state flag, their reaction, which was half-hearted, right? Their reaction was simply to adopt state military flags, which were traditionally seals on a bed sheet, and to adopt those as their state flags. So seals on a bed sheet are not dull as a consequence merely of pure aesthetics. They were meant to be dull, right? I think we lose that insight sometimes. They were meant to be dull. That was part of their political inspiration. That's part of their aesthetic, right? Sometimes we need to recognize that an aesthetic can be dull and can be intentionally dull. So in condemning them, we lose that nuance. So compare seals on a bed sheet to the subnational flags of places like Scotland and Texas that once represented nations in their own right and still aim to convey a sense of distinct identity or even potential secession, right? So there's a political message in there that we risk losing if we simply condemn them all outright. This also suggests a further important aesthetic question, however. As the movement to redesign state flags marches on, do we still need to consider their symbolic and visual relationship to the flag of the United States as a whole and to each other? Is it worth preserving, if only for sort of sake of nostalgia, is it worth preserving at least some seals on a bed sheet? Do we need to get rid of every single last one? Lest that initial design impulse, born of the tragedy of the Civil War, be lost. Flags also sometimes relate in a more straightforward way, so, simply spatially. They can be flown as a group or as an ensemble. Thus, in thinking about design qualities and aesthetics of flags, it pays to appreciate how they appear as an ensemble. For example, flying the relatively simple national flag of what was then Great Britain, along with the red ensign, and the considerably more complex royal standard, as in this 17th century painting by Isaac Sailmaker, creates an effect that is greater than the sum of the parts, right? You see of these three flags in three different genres, and they're displayed together. On land, national and regimental flags, right, as in this sort of Civil War illustration, have often been flown in tandem. And that's part of the point, right? They're flown in tandem, and the contrast of genres is part of what makes them effective together. Or consider the standard pairing of the United States flag and the flag of the President of the United States. To be sure, the presidential flag is a seal on a bed sheet, but the overall aesthetic effect, right, because they're almost always displayed together, the overall aesthetic effect is in the two flags side by side. We really cannot consider one without the other. Conversely, the aesthetic power of a group of flags sometimes inheres in their similarity or in their adherence to the same template. Israeli municipal flags, for example, are all variations on the national flag, with the Shield of David in the national flag, replaced by a locally meaningful symbol. So here, for example, is the combination of the flag of Israel and Jerusalem. And again, it's that spatial juxtaposition that's part of the aesthetic effect of displaying those flags and of designing them. The point is that in thinking about the aesthetics of flags, we need to keep in mind not just individual flags, but the way that flags can and often do appear in tandem. Debates that we have about complexity, about lettering, about all the other questions that are often featured in recent discussions about flag design, especially since the flag world's recent fascination with the effort to distinguish, quote, good flags from bad flags. Those debates take on a whole different coloration, so to speak, when we consider flags waved or hung together in groups. So earlier in this paper, I cited efforts to criticize entire genres of flags, but as I also suggested, we can still speak in aesthetically interesting and significant ways about how genres relate to each other. So the fourth type of relationship worth discussing among the fourth type of relationship that we can discuss is genealogical, the relationship of flags over time. Flag genres evolve. They influence each other, both positively and negatively. They even get exhausted and give way to new genres. They get revived. While it might well be dogmatic and counterproductive to try to judge entire genres, which is my earlier claim, Nevertheless, the most theoretically interesting and important relationship among flags and their design aesthetics might often lie in their vital generational relationship to each other. We routinely think about the history of architecture and the history of art generationally or genealogically. The stories are complex, they're never entirely linear. But consider, for example, the succession of ancient Roman architecture, Romanesque architecture, Gothic architecture, Renaissance, Baroque, Classical Revival, Gothic Revival, modern, right? Monumental modern, 2 more minutes, monumental modern and postmodern buildings. Or in an even shorter time frame, consider as mere selected examples of more complex and varied history in the history of art, right? Consider these succession, right? The succession of genres and traditions in the history of art just in the past couple of centuries. In all these cases, in art and architecture, some continuities are striking, but the discontinuities, right? The discontinuities are also vital. So one of the questions is, as flag genres evolve, what's going to come next? And how can we think of sort of aesthetically interesting ways about what might come next? I happen to love the new flag of Minnesota, which can be seen as simply another example of the sort of new tradition of flag design that Steve was talking about yesterday. But I actually think it goes further. I think it might be the beginning of at least one new type of genre, which is even more simplified, even more pared down than the sort of current trend in flag design. And in some ways, that strikes me as an exciting development. We can imagine, though, that one direction, right? We can imagine different directions that new genres might take. There's been a recent move to design county flags in England and leave it to the British to draw upon their own heraldic traditions, but modify them, right? This is another new genre, right? It's not good flag, bad flag. It's something else. And it's a powerful other direction. I'm not suggesting that American flags necessarily do this, but it's another historical, genealogical development. So if there's one correction I might make to Steve Knowlton's brilliant paper, which really was incredible, it would be to his claim that I dislike the current trends of good flag, bad flag. That's not right. It's not that I dislike them. I happen to like many of those flags. But all that I've tried to emphasize in my own work is that that trend is one genre among others. It should be understood not as a guide to style, but as a guide to one style. And we need to understand it genealogically, spatially, hierarchically, in all these ways to other genres. In sum, then, this paper has discussed 4 of the many ways that flags relate to each other. Vexillologists, in our dual capacity as both observers and critics, need to keep an eye out for whatever comes, keeping in mind always that the aesthetics of individual flags relate to each other with complex connections that might help define the larger ecology of flags as objects of power and wonder. Thank you. Well, certainly flags play that function, right? And so they're not just symbols of one's own country or one's own group. They can also be used precisely in the sense of political solidarity. An aesthetic question, I guess, would be, do some flags evoke that sort of solidarity more easily than others, right? And the Ukrainian flag, right? That's certainly one of the advantages of simplicity, right? The Ukrainian flag can evoke solidarity because it is so immensely familiar. And well, it wasn't originally familiar, right? But it became familiar in a very sort of simple and straightforward way. To be honest, if New York State were being invaded by New Jersey, and people wanted to show solidarity, I doubt that they would be flying the flag of New York all the time, right? Precisely for that reason, right? So there is this sort of connection between aesthetics and politics. But are there other ways to evoke solidarity other than just simplicity? Maybe.
Perry, thank you. Thank you, Perry. I really appreciate you extending the thinking on little book that I compiled 20 years ago. I appreciate this. I have a small comment that when your final slide, if it's possible to bring that up, that'd be great, of English country flags. I would like to assert that those also follow the basic principles of flag design articulated in Good Flag, Bad Flag. Nearly all of them check off all of those boxes. Ooh, we have suspense here as Andy brings it up. There. I find myself hoping that American cities look at these kinds of designs and adopt designs like this. So I think that there's sometimes a misunderstanding of what Good Flag, Bad Flag principles lead to. They also lead to these.
Right,
so I invite your comment
right,
on that, that it's not a different genre, it's just a different interpretation.
So without quibbling about how one defines a genre, you're right that if you were simply to look at the bare text of Good Flag, Bad Flag, these flags would clearly qualify, right? But when I think of the genre that was inspired, either inspired or represented by, and I'm going to let the historians decide that question, but when I look at the actual American designs that were either inspired by or represented by Good Flag, Bad Flag, there's a definite different look and feel to them. And to my mind, at least, that distinguishes them from some of these British flags, which much more explicitly get inspired by heraldic traditions, even though in this sort of more simplified fashion. And that difference is consistent, quite frankly, with the difference between the United Kingdom and the United States, right? Because except for Maryland, we explicitly rejected heraldic tradition a long time ago, right? I mean, it's interesting to look at Canadian flags, Canadian sort of civic flags and so on, because not surprisingly, some of them look very heraldic, right? They could easily be confused for a British flag. Some of them look very American in both the best and the worst ways. And that, when I taught an intensive course at the University of Western Ontario, I noticed that over the main door, there were sort of three symbols in relief. And it just fascinated me because it says something about how Canadians think of themselves. So on the one side, this is in a Canadian law school. On the one side was the American eagle, right? On the other side was the English lion, right? In relief over the door. And of course, in the middle was the beaver, right? So there's a sort of characteristic quality to Canadian identity, which I think gets reflected in its various flags, that sees itself as in some ways mediating between the two. Now, of course, given recent political developments, if I were to visit the University of Western Ontario Law School again, I might notice that the eagle had been erased, but who knows?
Hello, my name is Dylan Jones. I've been going to these NAVA meetings since St. Augustine, and this is finally the first comment I've been able to do. So this PowerPoint has to be my favorite one this year, just because how it perfectly puts into words how we must view flag design in the 21st century, in this kind of like idea you've been putting forth about flag genres and how, their distinctiveness. And that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you.